What are we going to be eating in the late 21st century? Whatever it is, we certainly won't be continuing what we eat now, nor in the amounts and portion sizes we consume today. Climate change and depleted soils will see to this. Our food systems are due for a major shakeup, not seen globally since the Neolithic 10,000 years ago. Does this sound important to you? Should we be paying attention to this? I guess this is too depressing because we all know about it and it seems far enough off in the future that it's like, well, we're still eating today. We still have water, right? Yeah, okay. I hear you. I hear you. This is a big claim, but it leads us with, oh, well, then what? What thing? And I think in this chapter, I I guess I want to give what I don't think they give us here, which is like, okay, we've been studying human ecology and political ecology and all these subsistence forms, but like, how is it that we are now entering this time of crisis? Was this always built into our world? And so what I want to do is go back over some of the points we made in the previous chapters and put this together in a way that I find your textbook sometimes has these specific examples, like about Bulgaria and people in Costa Rica or something, but doesn't like put it all together. So we have talked about in the foraging section that hunting and gathering was the way in which people spread all over the world. And they did it in different ways in different places. They were always connected to each other and trading and interacting with each other. But we have human beings being all over the world. And that included some places like the Arctic and some of the high altitude places and tropical rainforests that don't seem very habitable for human life. And in other places, like developing different systems of life, the human beings seem to have made those places better. They made them habitable. Places that you wouldn't think you'd be able to live, they improved them. And during this time, as humans developed different ways of interacting in these places, there were many different forms that people managed their resources. So hunting and gathering is not just a collect wild plants and animals. There's active involvement with the environment to manage the resources. We talked about the use of fire, for example, as a way of encouraging the plants and animals that you want to encourage. Horticulture develops, the domestication of plants and animals and small-scale gardens, and Swidden agriculture, slash and burn techniques, building on the use of fire. Intensive agriculture develops, where people start to concentrate maybe on one core crop. And pastoralism, or the herding of animals, which again, we talked about always interacts with agriculture and trade, but has a symbiotic relationship, ecological niches sometimes. Now, in all these times, as people develop these things, people were modifying the environment. They were changing it, sometimes in ways that we might consider beneficial, but there were some times that people did things that were probably not so good. They tried to over irrigate, or there were areas that became drier and didn't work. There were periodic times of scarcity and famine. But if you look over the world as of about 500 years ago, I I think you could say that you you could say that people did all kinds of really cool things in their environment and discovered all kinds of ways to survive and thrive, all kinds of different ways, and they were interacting with each other. And thus we have the title of our book, Human Adaptive Strategies, because this is quite an achievement. And so we have these human groups doing all these different ways of getting along, and not, there were some problems for sure, but it wasn't like the kinds of things that we are seeing today. Remember, they weren't shaking things up since the Neolithic. Now, The reason I want to tell you about that is because when I want you to be careful of people who just blame the things that are going on today on the human species, right? People who are like, that's the way humans are. Whenever they go into another place, they just do bad things. They kill all the animals, and the next they're they've wiped it out. One of someone I'd like to bring in here to talk to us about this, which I'm sure you've heard expressed in some form or another. Go places are just bad. They multiply, they kill all the big animals, they change the world, and so that's how we got to where we are. Now, in this chapter, they make an interesting observation about this. One of the reasons we should beware that idea is that up until about 200 years ago, the world's population remained remarkably constant. There was equilibrium between the human population and the areas in which there were. Again, in local places, there may have been some places that became overpopulated, but it wasn't a big deal around the world. So, have to watch out for these people who just say that humans are bad. It also ignores who is bad at what time, who did this thing to us, which we'll talk about. The other thing that I would like you to beware of is the idea that agriculture caused all the problems that we have. That if it just wouldn't have been for agriculture, people would have a beautiful life. See, even PowerPoint gave me this picture of like a field turning into desert. Now, the idea that agriculture caused all of our problems is an old idea, actually, but it was perhaps most famously expressed by a Jared Diamond article that was originally written in Discover magazine in 1987 called The Worst Mistake in the History of the Human Race. Yeah, the claim was that agriculture was this watershed moment. This time, we talked about the watershed, this dividing line between our greatest blunder. Today, you can go on YouTube and hear this person talk to you about it and, get the nutshell version of what is going on there. You have to watch out for this idea for a couple of reasons. For one thing, like the whole all humans are bad, it puts if all farming is bad, then it becomes so far away and so distant, it's impossible to imagine doing anything about it. And the other thing is, if you remember, horticulture, domestication of plants and animals, and farming arose independently in at least 15 different areas of the world. And there were all kinds of different ways to farm and integrate farming and agriculture into your economy. And in some of these places, there were problems, but in many of them, there were not. So the idea that it is agriculture, domestication that causes all our problems also is something to watch out for. Or pastoralism. Now, it is true that having animals and herding animals, you often have to feed those animals, and that takes a lot of energy. And animal herding in general can be a climate issue, but simply pastoralism, if you remember, as we talked about, herding animals is often done in these ecological niches where you're not going to be able to grow much anyway, remembering that only 11% of the Earth's land surface could be good for agriculture, and that people in these areas have been, in general, over the years, able to conserve their ecosystem, not make it into deserts. So again, I'm going to go back to 500 years ago, where you have these mixtures of, you have different people you have people hunting and gathering, small scale plantings, agriculture, pastoralism. As we've talked about, a lot of people were mixing these together. So horticulturalists who also hunted and gathered, hunters and gatherers who also planted, who went back and forth between these and who definitely traded with each other. There was also a lot of human migration. in terms of people, there weren't there weren't the same kinds of national borders that we have today. So a lot of hunters and gatherers, for example, would migrate over large areas, groups would form and reform. People have always been able to move around. Now, as I said, there were definitely some of these areas where they did have problems. And there were probably some of these societies that you wouldn't have wanted to live in because they were authoritarian or despotic or not good in various ways. But in general, as we look out across the world 500 years ago, people are in general able to balance their ecosystem, their population with their environment, and to be able to survive and thrive in all kinds of interesting ways. So that was then. What's happening in the now? I think it's a very important quote. Food is inequitably available as never before in human history. So some people, there's a lot of it. If it were equitably available, we'd have plenty of it. But it is not equitably available, and it is not being distributed in the ways in which it could be. I also wanted to just point out in terms of our agricultural system, as they talk about, and we talked about the ways in which agriculture tends to concentrate, but this has become perhaps quite extreme in terms of the crop varieties which have been reduced. We talked about those cloned bananas that are threatened by diseases because they're all the same. So the number of varieties has dramatically decreased in our times. What else is happening with those people who used to be able to migrate and go from place to place and look for work where you could just go around and look for work? What's going on with that? Yeah, we may have seen this recently on the news. They're making a big news thing about it, but it's not just in the United States. This is in various countries around the world where people who, again, it's not that everybody was free to move in the olden days, but 300, 500, 1,000 years ago, there simply weren't these kinds of borders and walls and restrictions on movement, and people. Migration is an essential way in which people have adapted to their environment, and today that is being increasingly restricted. A lot of this does have to do, of course, with the differences in population. So on the one hand, in the last 200 years, we have seen the extremely rapid increase of population to levels that are around the world seem rather enormous, billions of people, right? On the other hand, in some countries, Japan, South Korea, many of the European countries, France, Spain, Italy, we've seen a dramatic decrease in the birth rates to birth rates that are far below replacement rate. And so I think they mentioned here that in Japan, it's estimated they're going to have half the population they have now in a few years. Japan currently has the highest median age in the world, 48. It is projected to peak at 55. And so they're aging and they're not replacing the population. So we have this odd thing going on where on the one hand you have country where we have still a worldwide increase in population, but we also have these countries where the population is decreasing. And they also don't want people coming in because they want their borders secured. But where are the people who are going to take care of the old people? And in fact, assuming we still have something you would expect had been gone away by now. Why are people still having kids? Yeah, so on the one hand, we have places where they don't seem to be able to get enough people to work. On the other hand, we have people who are still in this situation which we thought might have gone away before, but it's still an issue. Even in our own country, putting kids in working. The thing that is happening on getting back to our farms and our food is the inequality in terms of who owns the farms and who's producing and how much output they're getting from that. Amanda, this was one of your questions. So I'm just going to read this sentence and we'll try to work through it. This is on page 201. First off, a little surprise. Farming in the United States, over 90% of American farms are family operated. Funny. As they say, contrary to the perception of many. So 90% of American farms are family operated, but there's far greater differences among them than there were a generation or two ago. Farms of 3,000 acres that gross more than 500,000 a year account for only 2% of the total, but produce 35% of the output. So what they're trying to say is that the farms have been concentrated at a high level where there's only a few farms that are huge, but they're producing lots and lots and making lots of money from that. The top 5% account for more than 50% of the output. So what they mean by top 5% is like talking about the top 1% in terms of income or wealth, that things have become very concentrated at the top. So we have top, let's say you had 100 farmers, there are 5 of them who are basically doing 50% of the output or have 50% of the land. This is a tremendous inequality. Whether it is better or worse than in the old days, I think that probably we would have to say it's become even more unequal than in previous years. They say it was lots of differences, even more than a generation or two ago. And as we talked about at the beginning of class, we apparently seem to be doing a lot of things that are unsustainable, that don't seem to be able to be, if you kept going on the trajectory we're going. And they mentioned something that's happening now in the Southwest, which they call the mega drought, which is called the mega drought. So it's more than just a long drought. It's a huge drought that started back in the year 2000, I think, and there's no signs of abating. They're currently trying to negotiate, for example, about what's going to happen with the Colorado River, but it's a huge problem for our farming industry. So if we think about 500 years ago and how people were living back then, and then we think about the now, we might ask ourselves, what happened? What happened in the in-between? And I think that's a good question, which our book doesn't tell us enough about. If you go back 500 years ago, roughly in the period from 1500 to say 1900, more or less, is a time in which this whole idea of being on the frontier actually comes out in life. And the idea that we were going to be expanding and expanding and expanding into new places and clearing the land, and that the whole world ahead of us was basically a Garden of Eden, was premised on getting rid of the people who were already in the Americas, in what is now the United States, in South America, in these places, to try and create this frontier, this place where agriculture and other practices could expand. And so that's what starts to happen. The whole idea of having a new frontier is based upon this. Now, one of the justifications of this displacement and pushing people off their land was the idea that, well, yes, they can hunt and gather, but that's not the most efficient way to work the land. And so the idea was that the indigenous peoples were not, they were just sitting there lazily collecting plants and animals, chasing things, and they weren't working the land like they should be and improving it. And so the idea was you had to change it over this land and to make it more productive. What became installed in many parts of the Americas, and especially in the Caribbean, in Brazil, in different places around the Caribbean, because it was especially the growth, the desire to plant sugar. cane, and to transform this land into a place where you could grow sugar cane, process it, and ship it back to different places was a huge transformation in the Americas and depended upon this idea of being able to take agriculture to this next level where you'd be, in many ways, doing an industry-like system on the land. Of course, this depended upon the enslavement of millions of people from Africa who were dragged to the Americas. Basically, most of them, the vast majority of them, were brought to the Americas to grow sugar. The single largest importer of enslaved Africans was Brazil. Approximately 4 million people just to Brazil, or 40% of the overall trade. But many islands in the Caribbean as well had a huge importation of Africans, mostly to do sugar. Now, it's during this time period that you really have this interaction between the factory, basically trying the farm and the factory become united so that your farms start to look more like factories. And in some ways, some people have argued that the factory was based on the template of the sugar plantation and production. But you have this rise of factory production. You have the rise of the cash crop, right? That you weren't growing food for your family or your immediate people. You were growing it for money. How much money could you make, Simi? $1 million on potatoes. That sounds like a rumor. That sounds like a myth. But the point was, you might be able to get rich. It's funny, I did think that was funny because during my field work in Colombia in South America, I was told by one person that when he was planting potatoes that he once made 1,000,000 pesos from one crop alone because the price went way up. So I don't know, maybe you can make $1 million from potatoes. So we have this idea of the cash crop that you farm mostly for making money rather than farming for food. We also have a rise in absentee ownership. Actually, a couple of you had a question about this study. Like I said, sometimes these examples get a little bit into the weeds, you might say, but I think one of the good parts of this example is the idea that a lot of the West was in fact farmed upon this model of entrepreneurship, of being able to make money off of this, of maybe owning the land from far away. It wasn't the only system that was going on, but in general, it's become the dominant way of seeing farming as a business. So when we talk about the new frontier, in fact, we've seen this dramatic change in the last few hundred years around how our food supply is produced and developed. Going into the time, again, roughly from the 1900s into about the 1960s, there was this continuance in European and North American ideas that the practices of people in other places, hunting and gathering, or horticulture, or swidden agriculture, or pastoralism, that maybe they were okay at producing for themselves, but they were probably not doing things efficiently, or maybe they were just dumb. And so basically what people wanted to do is replace that sort of those things with what we might call the industrial capitalist farm. And so specialization in high volume production depends on the availability of interchangeable parts, which requires a level of precision that did not develop in a significant way until the early 19th century, initially in the weapons industry. That was a curious little part. So we have this specialization in the development of interchangeable parts. And again, the idea is that that's what we need to do on the farm. We need to make it more specialized, more industrial. more accurate. The interesting thing also, though, is that even the people who called themselves communists or socialists over there, they wanted to do the same thing. They just wanted to call it collective ownership. And so they really wanted to take all those small farmers and bring them into these giant farms that would be able to produce lots of things. Both of these models resulted in some pretty serious environmental catastrophes. During this time, we believed, perhaps we still believe this, that science and industry were going to be able to fix everything quickly. You solve the problem right in front of you. So sometimes when you have this quick fix, then it results in a long-term problem. You've solved this problem, but then in the long term, you're not thinking about the long term. Or it creates other problems, they say. So the technological fix has often either you solve one problem and it creates another problem, or it doesn't, it is not necessarily a long-term solution. One of the solutions that was supposed to solve everything was known as the Green Revolution. Now, in the Green Revolution, they promoted these special seeds that they said were going to be high yield varieties. Blast in there and give people this high yield rice that's going to improve their yields. They seemed to be miracle crops at first because you could put out so much more. But as they describe it, they weren't actually high yield varieties, they were high responders. And so what happens is that they say they respond more efficiently to increases in fertilizers and water and have higher yields in optimum conditions. So sure, these were yields that seemed like a miracle as long as you had lots of irrigation, lots of fertilizer, lots of pesticides. And so then in those conditions, but often do poorly in bad years. And so again, like before, the benefits went to the richer farmers who could afford to buy the seeds and fertilizers and have readily available water. And so in many places, they're not liking these Green Revolution varieties. People always believe that there's a solution right around the corner to all of our problems. The newest one that they mentioned is going to solve all our problems now. It's going to solve all my problems. Jim, what's going to solve all my problems when I can push a button and it's going to, I want a car. Yeah, it's going to solve all my problems. I'm just going to print up my house. I'm going to print up a car, print up a cheeseburger. Yeah, I don't know. Can't believe it's going to solve the housing problem, right? That seems weird. Maybe, I don't know. For me, I think it's an example of we keep thinking the technological fix is right around the corner. Maybe it is. Maybe it is. Maybe that'll be the solution to everything. I'm not convinced yet. So the question is, or one of the questions is, now what? Study ourselves. Yeah, it might be good for people to like look at these farms and the farmers anthropologically. So I think that's a good development. Took us a long time, they said. But, you know, when we do that, we find out different things. The next thing that's going to happen is we read the next chapter, which is called Global Challenges in an Anthropological Perspective. Now, what I hope this chapter does, I'm not sure yet because I haven't read it. What I hope it does is tell us that we actually might be able to combine some of these indigenous techniques, some of the older techniques of forestry management, for example, through fire and the use of fire, some of these ways in which people have adapted to their environments that we tend to think of as not very efficient, but over time turn out to be more sustainable, that somehow from an anthropological perspective, we might get that long-term vision and that holistic understanding so that every time we fix something, it doesn't create another problem, or a short-term fix is not a long-term problem. So that's what I'm hoping this chapter is going to be about. Don't get too depressed, but we are able to combine ways in which people did live sustainably, sustainably is not necessarily in harmony, but sustainably in their environment with science and the ability to actually equitably feed people and distribute resources.